In the first instance, thank President Xu for his kind introduction and for his warm welcome to Fudan. Minister, ambassadors, distinguished guests, and above all else, students, it's a great pleasure to be here. May I first of all say in our own ancient language, Tá firkin áthas saram bhein sha liv agus shans laurt fui temine heapim hein will táhachtach dun tauki. I'm going to continue in English, and I think I wanted what I have just said. It is a great privilege to be asked to speak and give an address at one of China's oldest and most prestigious universities. As President of Ireland, it is an immense pleasure to be here in China, and I want to say how impressed I have been since the moment of my arrival, both at the breadth and the foresight and the mutual warmth and commitment to the future and its themes that has characterized my meetings with the President of the People's Republic of China, the Prime Minister, and the Chairman of the Assembly of the People, and so many others. I think our two peoples, as the President has said, are united in friendship. It is a friendship for the building of which two previous visits to China by my predecessor, former President Mary McAleese, was of course very helpful. That visit 11 years ago was the last state visit, and then President McAleese made a working visit later. So it's 11 years since we've had a state visit by the President of Ireland to China, and I'm very privileged to be making that visit. I want to say as well that this visit comes about at the invitation of the President of the People's Republic of China. Then Vice President Xi Jinping visited me at Orasanuktaron, the home of the President in Ireland, and we had a very warm conversation which continued during this visit. But I always, on these visits that I make to other countries, really seize on the opportunity of speaking in a university or in a place of learning. It's a kind of addiction that academics have. It is very hard to resist the opportunity of encountering ideas. And after I have spoken, I hope to have the opportunity, if you wish, to ask me any questions. There is a very long history of cultural engagement of the Irish people with China, and it of course predates the establishment of formal diplomatic relations with the People's Republic of China in 1979. For an example from science, it is interesting to note that it was an Irishman, Dr. Augustine Henry, who greatly expanded Europeans' knowledge of China's flora by sending back to Europe thousands of dry specimens and seeds in the late 19th century. 185,000 specimens, which recognized 1,726 new species of plants, which are recorded in Kew Gardens in London. And Augustine Henry's knowledge of botany and medicinal plants was recognized in China when one of the buildings of the Fan Memorial Institute of Biology was named in his honor. But then, of course, Irish people had an early account in their own language, the Irish language, Gaeilge na hÉireann, of one of the very first documented interactions between Europe and China, when Marco Polo's chronicles of his travels to Kublai Khan's court at Beijing in the late 1200s was translated into the Irish language within a century of its happening, about 150 years before a translation became available in the English language. At that time, even though we were experiencing the beginning of a long and difficult relationship of colonization, the Norman invasion had just begun in the 12th century in Ireland. And because of its subsequent subjugation to British rule, Ireland was, as a result, unable to establish relations with China in its own right. But after we gained our political independence in the 1920s, Ireland was one of a small number of Western countries who between 1957 and 1971 was anxious to support the process which led to the representation of the People's Republic of China at the United Nations, and that the people should be represented by the administration which spoke for the mass of the people. And this issue would arise much later in relation to the work of the International Olympic Committee, which was then chaired by Michael Killanan, Lord Killanan. It struck Ireland as incongruous back then that the mass of the people of a nation of what was at that time around 500 million people, with such a distinguished and ancient history, was not represented or might even indeed be excluded in the whole of the United Nations. And our minister at the time, Frank Aiken, and his delegates were forthright in offering that opinion. And thus, in 1971, Ireland supported the People's Republic of China's recognition and admission to the United Nations. Now, with the establishment of diplomatic relations between our two countries in 1979, the reciprocal friendship between the Irish and the Chinese, it has gone since that time from strength to strength. Our relationships have widened and deepened through productive and mutually beneficial cooperation in so many areas, through academic, cultural and commercial exchanges, as you have heard, and through that multitude of encounters which our mobile and globalized world fosters between the Chinese and the Irish people. Ireland's Chinese community, it's one of the largest migrant groups in our country, and it is one that greatly contributes to enriching contemporary Irish life. And I know that China, and this city in particular, Shanghai, which I'm visiting for the first time, and delighted to do so, is home to a very young and vibrant Irish community, so many of which I met last evening. And thus, although geography, scale, and our respective historical journeys may differ in some degree, yet there are significant aspects of the collective experience of the Irish and Chinese people which enables us to conduct a historically informed conversation, one that perhaps differs from those that China may have with other countries from the part of the world which we inhabit, Europe. China fully appreciates the fact that Ireland is exceptional in being a Western European country without a colonizing or imperialist past, and that as a consequence, having secured political freedom, it could be expected to engage in international relations in a way that recognizes the freedom and the emancipatory struggles of other peoples. Ireland attaches great importance, for example, to cultural freedom, which it sees as a wellspring of its own independence. Our own independence at the beginning of the 20th century was succeeded a very strong movement of cultural assertion. And so when Ireland and China come to exchange views on important matters, we can do so in all authenticity and sincerity, and with a genuine mutual respect for our shared experience of resisting domination. Such is the spirit which has infused, as I have said, all of my conversations with Chinese leaders throughout this state visit. And such is also the spirit with which I have prepared my remarks to students and faculty today. Ireland's and China's collective experiences resonate in many ways. That here are two peoples who at several points in their respective histories have been required to modernize in respect of change. Ireland, for example, was forced to embrace a new language, not chosen by us only for commercial purposes, but imposed, and the speaking of our own language, Ireland, prohibited with penalties. We were forced to embrace this new language, English, and then, of course, as people like Chinese people and Irish people do. We moulded it for our own creative purposes, and this is reflected in the work of William Butler Yeats, Oscar Wilde, James Joyce, George Bernard Shaw, Samuel Beckett, Seamus Heaney, and a host of contemporary writers, so many others. But then China too modernized many times throughout its history, and the Chinese people know, as a result of that it would be quite impertinent to suggest to either of us that there is a single model of modernization. There is no single model of modernization, despite the rather scholarly pretensions of, let us say, the Princeton studies of the 1960s, which I studied myself in the 1960s, when so many of us were invited to come along and study the backwardness of our own people and the inevitable evolution of such peoples towards what was regarded as an inevitable single form of modernity. Then too, within the short period of little more than a generation, China and Ireland have stepped out of several decades of relative economic isolationism into a globalized world of trade, aware, of course, of both its promise, its challenges, and its assumptions. Both of our peoples have swiftly shifted from a predominantly rural way of life to an urban-based economy driven by industry, and increasingly recent times, as an aspect of globalization, services too. Of course, such rapid transformations have always brought their own challenges. These are challenges that are both intellectual and practical, to which Ireland and China are now called to respond. In Ireland, the insertion of our national economy in emerging global value chain from the mid-1990s in particular, coupled with access to the European Union's single market, were factors which underpinned a period of positive economic growth. And it also, of course, with employment consequences, facilitated access to wider markets. However, in more recent times, the Irish economy has been engulfed in a recent decade in a credit-led speculative property bubble, underpinned by very light regulation in financial markets, not all of which could have ever been within Irish control, and which is part, of course, of the global financial meltdown of 2008. The social, economic, political, and moral consequences of this collapse have been devastating in Ireland, indeed as they have been for the rest of Europe, and particularly for the prospects of the young people of Europe. Fortunately, the Irish people, once again calling on a resilience hard earned, made great sacrifices, and they have worked very hard to come out of the depths of this crisis and embark upon a renewed journey of what we hope will be a sustainable prosperity for all. And today Ireland is seeing the fruit of such hard-won efforts. Our economy is growing again, and it is important to note that even as we now concentrate on the real economy, in science-driven economies, part of that, parts of our real economy, even during the recession, in agribusiness and its related exports, were growing, and growing consistently. During the worst of the recession, they increased by over 42%. Despite such positive trends, however, and as I am in an academy of learning, it is, in my view, crucially important that we do not let go to waste the opportunity of addressing the root causes and assumptions of the recent and worldwide crisis, its logic, and the intellectual sources of the models that ended in such disaster for so many. It is important that we interrogate the values, the model of society and economy and their connection, and the vision of international relations that has failed not only for us Irish, but for so many on our shared and vulnerable, fragile planet. Indeed, there is a context to this crisis that must be recognized. For example, over the past couple of decades, most governments in the world have been placed under pressure to orchestrate a shrinking of the role of the state, of state action. And this has had the consequence of leaving an enormous institutional and regulatory void in governing globalized markets, and has created a unique form of accountability, absent in terms of transparency, seemingly uncontrollable in relation to its consequences, and reaching into and beyond the borders of the legitimacy of accountable governments. This model, postulating an efficiency and sustainability of the self-regulated market brought to some extremes, was grounded in a very narrow scholarship and a partial vision of economic theory, one which, however, became hegemonic, and it claimed a near exclusivity in the teaching and research of economics departments across the world. From such failed paradigms and narrow intellectual formations, may I suggest, and I say so as a person practically involved, as well as a person who has been lecturing in these areas, may I suggest we must break free. We must seize this opportunity of exploring alternative models of socioeconomic and cultural development. It is my profound conviction that in this task, China has much to contribute to the conversation that is already underway in so many parts of the world on the possibilities that exist for building a new pluralism and a diversely sourced and shared ethic that might be placed at the heart of a globalization that we could both understand and offer our different diverse contributions. The emergence of new poles of demographic vitality and the re-emergence of older ones are necessarily lapping the waves against an international architecture which was designed in a very different era. And for particular circumstances, in the wake of what I suggest was the detritus that constituted competing imperialisms and the wars to which they led, and which, of course, consumed the lives of so many of the young. There is currently no major global issue, I suggest to you, that does not involve and will not involve the Middle Kingdom or require its cooperation. Thus, contemporary China is faced with a unique opportunity of being able to engage with the world without being constrained to adopt any externally imposed model of development, such as happened in the 19th century, for example, when a path of aggressive mercantilism was forced onto your nation. And I understand why young people would want to hear of the unequal treaties in the same way as we ourselves can understand but must not forget our own famine. Today, the Chinese people are in a position to freely and creatively engage with change, explore the possibilities for the new models that require to be crafted. And these models, I hope, will be inclusive of the mass of the people in terms of social protection, political participation, and cultural expression, so as to facilitate a real democratic achievement, such as, for example, Dr. Sun Yat-sen would have wanted. My wish as president of a country which deeply values multilateralism would be that China seizes this opportunity, not just to foster cultural and socioeconomic progress among its own people, but also to enhance and extend the standing and effectiveness of those multilateral institutions that are concerned with humanity's common good, and which carry the responsibility as a result that must be attached to such multilateral institutions. There is a new world to be made, a world that requires a new architecture of revitalized and adequately resourced multilateral institutions based on mutuality, recognition of diversity, long-visioned commitment, a recognition of the obligations that arise from the intergenerational nature of our responsibilities, for example, towards our shared planet. And this new architecture must also confer the capacity to anticipate and provide an alternative to, for example, a violent uprising of the excluded or oppressed, or otherwise we may find ourselves once again reeling from old and revived fundamentalisms, new conflicts based on old prejudices and ignorance. Multilateralism, I suggest, must be revived then as so much more than an aspiration or a rhetorical abuse of language, or as a locus, as I have just said, as a locus for some kind of inauthentic expression of sentiment. In recent years, we might well ask, how often has the Security Council been in the position of responding to crises in a reactive fashion only, on the basis of concepts borrowed from the urgency of humanitarian operations, because it had failed to reach agreement on fundamental political objectives? Be it in the areas of global security, trade, or climate change, multilateral organizations have fallen short of concluding important negotiations over the last decade, and we have had to be content rather with intermediary agreements that are again and again postponed to the future definite and durable solutions. And I have noticed so often that those most learned scholars on the United Nations, of which I am a supporter, they say it saved us perhaps from the worst of ourselves, and it enabled us to retreat sometimes from our impossible positions, our positions which we could not justify. But such a state of affairs is as unsatisfactory as it is dangerous, and all the more so in light of the great common challenges that face humanity in this new century. I know that your country has, through the voice of its leaders, pledged, for example, to act as a responsible player in the multilateral system. For ever since its accession to the United Nations in 1971, the People's Republic of China has taken on increasing political and economic responsibilities on the world stage by joining numerous existing international organizations and establishing its own structures of cooperation, in particular in the regional context. And it is with this in mind that I so warmly encourage China to continue to actively seek to contribute to putting the multilateral system back on tracks, and to be creative in the design of a revitalized and necessary multilateral architecture. Let us pause for just a moment and ask, is there an alternative to this? What is the alternative to multilateralism? As the head of state of a country within a continent that has been devastated in the last century by 2 world wars and a Great Depression, it is my profound conviction, shared by so many Europeans I know, that a world where peace depends merely on balanced power relations and on the distraction of science and technology into the production of armaments, that this is such a narrow conception of its national interests, and it leads entirely to a world that is a dangerous world. We should strive rather to reinvigorate a genuine society of nations, between and among whom a real dialogue is organized. What do we mean by dialogue? It is one that would allow for a concerted undertaking of common actions governed by the rule of law, aimed at advancing our shared interest in global peace and prosperity. And I believe that this can be achieved without undermining national sovereignties. It is possible, in other words, to achieve a transnational consensus on values that manifest the fundamental dignity of the person and her context, while also recognizing the legitimate authority of the state. Unfortunately, such a dialogue between nations is currently impeded by the upsurge, as I have said, of dangerous versions of nationalism and fundamentalism across the world. And this is happening in Europe itself, where racism is appearing in some of our cities, in Africa, in America, and also here in Asia. Multilateralism, then, as a set of principles, it relies on interlocking of institutions at the national level, to the regional and global levels. It is based on a vision of spaces and interests as being in solidarity with the world and its members rather than exclusionary, and of identities as being complementary, if different. It calls upon us to recognize that decisions are improved through negotiation with others, and that mutuality and interdependence are a strength. Neither are they an impediment, nor neither are they a weakness. There are times, then, when the nations of the world are faced with both unprecedented opportunities and challenge. And for a country like Ireland, committed as we are to a harmonious, legitimate and efficient multilateral system, we attach importance to China's rise, that it be recognized in context and accommodated in a collegial manner, a manner that brings this multilateral system of which I speak together at a higher level as we make a new century. And it is a century with enormous challenges. For example, if I might give an example, if we are to feed 9 billion people on our planet by 2050, we have to expand agricultural production, food production by 60%. And how are we to do this? And should it be left to speculative tendencies? In the 1990s, for example, speculation in food futures was about 12%. In 2011, it was 61%. So you have speculation at international level in essential foodstuffs. And at the same time, we are regularly moved by seeing in our new technology in television the consequences of famines that happen now no longer in a way in which we are not aware, but we are fully aware. I'm very glad later to answer any questions about what I perceive to be the moral contradictions that arise in relation to that. Also, the consequences. For every time there is a rise of 1% in global foodstuffs, the rise internally in any country in Africa, which I recently visited, is 33%. So therefore we have to make choices. An independent, market-driven, unaccountable system in relation to food, or the capacity to feed the world in a sustainable and ecologically responsible way. These are issues to which we can return. But it isn't appropriate in an academy to simply note something without being concerned. And we should be concerned that 1 in 7 people on our planet, 925 million people, are in fact in hunger as I speak. The global nature of the great challenges that we are facing can only be tackled effectively through concerted action grounded in an ethical consciousness of our fundamental interdependency and our vulnerability to, and the limits of what we can do, and the reason we have to commit to dialogical conversations about different options. We are human beings who dwell together on a fragile planet, and the consciousness that is necessary must not be limited to a narrow individualism, but it has to take into account the future challenges, history, culture, and diversity. We need to develop, if we are to advance in all of these areas, a preliminary discourse that is genuinely dialogical. I would now just turn to some of the challenges, as I've said, beyond the ones I have mentioned. These are ones that I discussed with the President of the People's Republic of China, both in Dublin and this week. He identified, and I agreed, as the defining issues for our times, subjects such as peace, prosperity, a prosperity which in both of our views includes environmental sustainability and the progress of civilization, recognizing that there are many civilizations in the history of humankind. As for the first challenge, the building and sustaining of international peace, I'm delighted to be able to say that both Ireland and China are in a practical sense constructively engaged in supporting the work of the United Nations in conflict prevention, mediation, resolution. Indeed, Ireland's membership of the United Nations is a central part of our foreign policy for over half a century, and Irish Defence Forces have been participating in peacekeeping operations throughout the world. And I know that China's commitment to the United Nations is similarly based on a long-standing respect for the role of the United Nations in the maintenance of international peace and security. At present, Ireland has soldiers serving as peacekeepers in United Nations operations across Europe, Africa and the Middle East. But I am pleased to tell you that Irish troops and officers are serving alongside Chinese counterparts in a significant number of the operations in Cyprus, Côte d'Ivoire, Western Sahara, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Mali, South Sudan and in Lebanon. I have visited Ethiopia just in the last couple of weeks, and there I witnessed at first hand the predicament in Gabala of almost 200,000 refugees from South Sudan. And thus I'm very pleased to learn that some additional 700 Chinese peacekeepers are expected to join a United Nations mission in the Republic of South Sudan at the start of 2015. And this is welcomed by the Irish government. China and Ireland thus share a similarly deep commitment to the peaceful settlement of disputes, to the resolution of conflicts, and we commit our greatest resource to that task, and you do the same, our greatest resource, our people. And Foreign Minister Wang Yi, addressing the United Nations General Assembly in September of this year, emphasized the importance of political solutions to current global challenges. His words were, "History and reality have repeatedly demonstrated that to meet violence with violence will not lead to enduring peace." I fully share these sentiments, and I hope that our two countries, together with our partners, can continue to promote the pacific settlement of international disputes in line with the principles of, for example, the Charter of the United Nations. It is my firm conviction, too, that together we can advance proposals so that natural resources, so often the origin and cause of conflicts, may become instruments for post-conflict reconstruction and reconciliation between peoples. And may I turn to that second challenge that I mentioned, that is facing our multilateral system. The need to foster balanced socio-economic development across the planet, and more particularly, to ensure, as you have heard me say, that food security is provided for the world's poorest people. May I begin by recognizing immediately how this particular challenge, the world has much to learn from China's demonstrated ability to take far-sighted decisions when confronting complex policy questions. Sometimes we need to remind ourselves of how 21% of the world's population has been fed on 9% of the arable surface of the planet and 6% of its fresh water. It is widely acknowledged that China's current economic development is the result of careful long-term planning initiated back in 1978, for example, with such measures as was proposed by President Deng Xiaoping's reform and opening up policy. The ability at setting and then meeting long-term targets was so strikingly illustrated in the way China managed to achieve some of the world's sharpest reductions in poverty and chronic hunger over the last 3 decades. For example, between 1981 and 2011, in 30 years, those moved out of extreme poverty in the world was 921 million. But of that 921 million, 746 million were in the People's Republic of China. So uniquely, your country has been ahead of schedule in meeting the first of the Millennium Development Goals, reducing by half the proportion of chronically hungry people as you have done. This is a most remarkable achievement, and it is one, in fact, that China can well be proud of, representing, it does, 2/3 of the global achievement in lifting people out of extreme hunger. I think it can be regarded as an economic triumph, but it is above all else a human triumph in that so many of your fellow citizens are now able to enjoy lives free from food insecurity. At a conference a year ago, the Director General of the Food and Agricultural Organization in Rome, Jose Graziano da Silva, described it as follows: China's tremendous feat of feeding 20% of the world's population with 9% of its arable land and 6% of its fresh water is an incredible achievement. And he went on to praise China's effort at sharing its expertise with other developing countries, notably in Africa, in areas such as irrigation, livestock, fisheries, crop production, and agroforestry. And everyone here will agree that it is impressive to see China thus transforming itself within such a short period of time from a recipient to a provider of technical assistance, new development suggestions, and funding to other developing nations. So I'm convinced that in offering recognition for such achievements, that it will be a source of energy in the vital role that you will play in contributing to delivering what is one of the most fundamental of human rights, namely the right to food and adequate nutrition. And what a good base that is for economic, social and cultural rights and other rights. Ireland as a country has been affected, of course, as I have said, was affected by a devastating famine in the 19th century. That is why we have such an interest in hunger in our foreign policy, in our aid policy, in the relief of hunger. And now also what we are engaged in and which we can cooperate in is upscaling nutrition. It is a key priority. It represents 20%, 1 unit in 5 of the overseas development aid budget that is managed by our agency Irish Aid. And I'm pleased to say that our country, Ireland, has been appointed with Kenya as one of the 2 co-facilitators of the United Nations negotiations on the post-2015 Sustainable Development Goals. That work is happening now. And I can assure you that Ireland looks forward to working closely with China and our other partners to contribute to a strong, measurable global development agenda that will seek to eradicate extreme poverty in the next generation through a process which gives voice to those most affected by global inequalities. Prosperity, of course, is not measured only through the prism of growth rates which are themselves changing, or even solely in economic terms itself. There are serious reasons to believe that the current path of global economic growth and all of the metrics that go along with it are simply not sustainable. And they might end up, if no radical action is taken at global level, in an irreversible destruction of our natural environment. As anthropologist Margaret Mead put it so long ago, we won't have a society if we destroy the environment. And one of the most pressing issues of our times then, as I'm coming to the last part of my paper, is to find a way of balancing sustainability with the right to development. What forms of development, we ask ourselves, can be made to fit with the higher values of environmental protection and human welfare? What are the respective responsibilities of industrial and developing countries in that regard? These are the questions to which the multilateral debate must respond. These are the basis for our reflection, and institutional action must be directed to policies that can address them. But engaging the dialogue on such questions, we must make sure that the visions offered are informed by long-term consequences if international justice is to be achieved. And I know that the consequences of the environmental crisis are acutely felt already in China: water pollution, water shortages, soil pollution, desertification, energy scarcity. These are all issues which the Chinese government recognizes and to which it is actively seeking to respond. Then there is the astounding scale and challenge of urbanization and the question of the sustainability of mega cities, which raises a new set of challenges. And then there is the search for new models of regional and territorial balance, the exploration of new forms of rural development and sustainability, new directions in urban planning, of developing, if you like, new roles, if you like, for urban form. These are great challenges, and they are challenges to young people, both in terms of scholarship and policy. And we in the West, of course, should exercise restraint in any urge to propose ready-made solutions to China's environmental problems. China will have to develop its own model of inclusive and sustainable development for all of the Chinese people. And I believe that it has the capacity and the required long view, the intellectual history, the intellectual heritage to choose to do so. And indeed, Westerners might well, lest they be urged to have any urge towards moral superiority on environmental matters, when through history they have in fact contributed themselves so significantly to pollution in developing countries. And you know, as I came to Shanghai, I was reminded of George Bernard Shaw's message when he addressed the Chinese people on the occasion of his visit to Chongqing in Shanghai in 1933 that the President has referred to. It is not for me, Shaw wrote, belonging as I do to a quarter of the globe which is mismanaging its affairs in a ruinous fashion, to pretend to advise an ancient people striving to set its house in order. I think, however, we must all move out of our categories of thinking to produce new solutions to what is an unavoidable problem. Those who have not yet initiated a sufficient process of critical reflection, by the way, in relation to the past, we must acknowledge the past, face it, and move on. I think we will find ourselves contributing without understanding to the continuation of models which in fact will not serve our future challenges. However, any tendency, therefore, we must decide not to lecture each other. I suggest that what we need is a discourse, as I've said, that is genuinely dialogical. Finally, an area on which we must be very clear, in which multilateral cooperation is not just mutually beneficial, but is absolutely essential, is, as I have said, making sure that the final talks in Paris in 2015 on climate change will be successful. Climate change is the most serious threat our planet has ever faced. It is one for which there simply is no other option than a collective and coordinated global response. One of my predecessors, Mary Robinson, as President of Ireland, she has been asked by Ban Ki-moon to coordinate, if you like, the positions of different countries in preparation for the Paris talks. Global warming shows us, rather than as a patchwork of nations, we are deeply interdependent and interconnected. As members of a common humanity, we must produce our solutions, and beyond, as part of a global ecosystem that we share with other species of life on our planet. And I know, and it has been emphasized in the talks that I have attended, that Chinese leaders take climate change very seriously, and that China has invested substantially, for example, in cooperation with many Irish companies, new young Irish companies, in renewable sources of energy and energy efficiency. And I was delighted to hear of the joint announcement then made just a month ago in November on the occasion of the APEC summit by President Xi and US President Barack Obama on the emission goals to be proposed at the United Climate Change Conference in Paris next year. And I've been very pleased at the positive note that has been continued this week in the talks in Peru. China has pledged to reach peak carbon emissions by 2030, if not sooner, by increasing the use of clean energy sources, such as solar power and windmills, to 20% by 2030, is highly commendable. Although those goals may not exist at the moment in a formal agreement, they have been repeated, as I have said, at the most recent talks. And the fact that the world's two largest economies, the two largest sources of carbon emissions, were able to announce solid numbers after months of negotiations is to be welcomed by all of us. It is the job of governments to define objectives, make policy decisions, and take action accordingly in consultation with its people. And as leaders, we are called to show conviction, clarity, courage, and consistency in our actions. However, it is the job of young people, of students like yourselves, who will inherit and take care of this planet, to make sure that your decision makers remain focused on the goal of handing on a safe and hospitable world to future generations. And in the achievement of that, you must be both creative and courageous. So in speaking about some of those global challenges, we Irish and Chinese jointly face in this 21st century, I have endeavoured to address some of the areas, just some, where there is a need for a new, effective form of multilateralism, one that has pluralism and mutual respect at its heart. The lessons learned by humanity throughout the 20th century, of course, must not be forgotten or lost in any renewed hubris of the strong. We do not need any more meaningless confrontations based on war or the threat of war. And in the task of forging this new multilateralism of humanism, there is a role for large and strong countries such as China, as well as for smaller but intellectually and diplomatically active countries such as Ireland. And there is a role in all of this for the sincere, open, and inevitably sometimes challenging dialogue that Ireland and China are willing to pursue with each other. And because of our friendship, are free to pursue with each other. The unlimited exchange of friends who are concerned with and respectful of one another. That dialogue will only succeed if it is underpinned by genuine mutual understanding and vibrant intercultural exchanges. An Irish scholar, put it, another attempt if you wanted to do it differently. If you had come to lecture, it was, of course, something that happened in the 1700s between Lord Macartney and the then Emperor. And the diplomat wrote afterwards, the importance of remaining open in pragmatic as well as ideological terms, each to the overtures of the other. Building cordial relations is not just about profit. It means learning to read and respect the cultural cues as well. That observation has lost none of its validity today in today's world. We live in an area of unprecedented mobility. People are moving from the countryside to cities, between countries, between continents. But let us never forget between cultures. And such mobility demands an ability to adopt new modes of thinking and living and be creative. And at the global level, it requires a deep understanding and an openness to other cultures, to the diversity of memory, to the possibility of forgiveness, and the integrity of imagined futures. I know that these are views that are shared by the President of the People's Republic of China when he spoke in the college after the first president to visit the institutions of the European Union. And when he spoke in Bruges, at the college in Bruges, he said, to move our friendship out, to move our relationship forward, China needs to know more about Europe, and Europe needs to know more about China. Only when we know where a country has come from can we possibly understand why this country is what it is today and to which direction it is heading. I profoundly believe that students and academic institutions, such as Fudan University, have a fundamental role to play in advancing the kind of deep intercultural conversation that we need between China and Europe and between China and Ireland. And may I avail then of this opportunity to salute the work of, for example, Professor Dai Songrong, who has made a contribution to the appreciation of Irish literature in China that the President has referred to, and also through his translation of the first volume of Finnegan's Wake by James Joyce. I only say, Professor Dai, I'm sure, is a very meticulous and patient person, and I salute his courage. I know that Fudan has several joint programs in place with the University College Dublin. We signed a new understanding today, and I was delighted to witness the signing of 2 memoranda of understanding with another Irish university, Trinity College Dublin, to promote student exchanges, joint research in the humanities, cooperation with our oldest university, will also contribute to the development of the Trinity Centre for Asian Studies, which will be an important in advancing scholarship on the great and diverse Chinese civilizations. May we then, in Irish I would say má focail scircun creek a carlish and metatolarum, to finish. May we are in our collective efforts now and in the future breathe new life then into the spirit of internationalism and cross-border solidarity, such as infused the visit of George Bernard Shaw to Shanghai in 1933, so that together we may craft a truly peaceful, plural, humane and inclusive world civilization that is worthy of our peoples and their futures. Goraf Mila Mahaki, thank you. 谢谢大家。
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Thank you very much. For your sharing the insight, deep insight on the many of the issues we face, particularly in global peace, environmental protection, economic development, and also multilateralism. We are encouraged, also enlightened by your talks and also by your cause for truly peace, plural and humane world civilization. And also we will respond to your call that Fudan should actively involve in the cultural conversation between China and Europe. We will do that. So to that end, we will join hands and work together. I believe many students would like to have some questions to you, but we only have limited time. So who would like to begin first? Already one here, and another one over there. So the microphone might have to be ready for another gentleman. Okay.
So thank you, Mr. President, for your speech. So my question is, you mentioned global hunger in your speech, and then you talked about how China and Ireland actually participated in helping it. So what is your view of global hunger, and what do you think the international community as a whole can do to react to this issue?
Yes, I mentioned, I think that 1 person in 7 is hungry in the world at the present time. And if you look at the pattern of that hunger, it differs. And this connects as well with my views about economics to some extent. And it's where theory in economics has to draw a distinction between what I believe are meeting human needs and addressing the demands of the marketplace. We in Ireland, for example, are involved in tackling global hunger in 2 ways. We are involved in our Irish Aid project with scaling up nutrition in many countries in Africa. When I visited recently Ethiopia, Malawi, and South Africa, you could see that there are things you can do in relation to, let us say, an energy-efficient stove in a rural area in Malawi. You go to the refugee camps in Gambela, and if you can, in fact, actually find an efficient way of cooking food, you also have something that goes beyond hunger. It is safer for women, for example, who have to travel long distances to gather firewood, who may be attacked not only from natural challenges, but might be attacked through gender-based violence. Then there is the amount of time that the woman spends in gathering water and in gathering food. There is one profile where very little, if you like, assistance can in fact have a life-changing effect. You then look at other areas where, in fact, some of the extreme hunger has been reduced. And the new challenge is in scaling up nutrition and in what, for example, adequate diet that has a huge effect in relation to child development and the capacity of children to learn. You then move across the world to where we, as a food-producing nation, and we sell into some of the richest parts of food consumption in the world. There, the challenge is, in fact, to produce that food in a sustainable way that takes account of the environmental conditions. It's also a factor, I believe myself, and I think I spoke about it in one of my other addresses during the week. Very important for us to respect the relationship between people and the land. There's an interesting fact which doesn't get sufficient, I think, attention, which has come out of both the IMF, the World Bank, and the Food and Agricultural Organization. And that is, let us say, for example, the increases in food productivity in Western Africa, 74% of that is provided by women. Then you look at another a part of that as well, and you'll find that smaller holdings are far more productive than vast areas. and then again that affects both China and other countries as well, are other vast areas. The people who are in fact actually waiting, or sometimes those who are hostile to the future of China, nearly always hinge their criticism around the concept of scarcity. That China will run out of food, China will run out of resources, China will run out of energy, China will run out of skills, and so forth. What I think they forget is the degree of the changes that are there to be made, and that China has made already. But one of the things that I think is very, very important, and it comes from the talks that I referred to that will finish in Paris in 2015, is that we must now, I think, realize that there have to be very serious concessions on the part of those countries that are developed countries or high carbon producing countries. But then in the South and the South-to-South cooperation, the last talks did not provide a transfer of technology or capacity so that developing countries are able to, in fact, make their own contribution. But I think there is a new atmosphere in the talks. I think that it will happen. But when we think of it at the present time, as I said as well, to feed 9 billion people will require by 2050 an increase of 60% in food production. But I did ask you to also reflect on what I feel is the moral contradiction. People, for example, cannot avoid famines because now of television. They see people die in front of them on screen. But then at the same time, are they moved to ask, why should food as be reduced to being a commodity that is traded? And I gave you the figure. In the 1990s, futures in relation to the food area were something of the order of 12% in the 1990s. In 2011, there were 61%. In other words, you had people waiting to make a hit on food. So therefore, we are challenged, you are challenged as young people, to draw distinction, if you like, between the needs of the planet and the insatiable capacities for consumption of a particular narrow version of the economic world. These are what we do. The only thing I say is we must, if you're about it all, we must be able to talk about these without an atmosphere of confrontation. We must be able to listen. And of course, in the different philosophical systems of our world, is there any place richer than goes right back to the different philosophical sources in China? I wish you well in the discussion.
Another question? Yeah, please.
Thank you, President. Thank you for a very inspiring speech. And I remember that in your speech you mentioned about a lot of global challenges and how to solve these challenges. And my question is, what can be done to engage more young people like us as university students to engage in global challenges such as climate change and other challenges? Thank you.
Yes. I think that, may I say that when I was teaching in the social sciences, just to say where the way that the world was then, I refer to the Princeton studies so that people know what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the work of Gabriel Hammond, Lucian Pye, Huntington, all of those. There are about 6 major books, and these 6 major books defined modernization as was then understood. And it drew a distinction between developed countries and backward countries. The more refined versions, as it went into the 70s, spoke about a continuum along which countries were placed. And many of us went to the United States to study empirical sociology. At my time, people like Orlando Falls-Borda was there and other people like that. We were really being asked to look at what was wrong with our own countries in ways and really. Then much later you got dependency theory, then you got other forms of different theory. Where I am now then, I think, was all those theories at least had a notion of structure. And then we went into a postmodernist period, and the idea that nothing was fixed and so forth. It had some advantages in terms of its openness to critical thought. But the difficulty where I am now, it's very interesting to look at the media and the general comment on the crisis of 2008. which really started with the amendments to the Glass-Steagall Act, which allowed product at the request of Greenspan and others to float into the world and originally found their way into pension funds, then into central banks, and thus you had the position that we ended up in. But you might ask, apart from those who've already won the Nobel Prize and are now seeing, in fact, what economic theory brought us, there are those, why were we not able to analyse what went wrong? And then I think you'll find in many cases, in the same way as World War I, where one significant writer has suggested, perhaps rather strongly, that people sleepwalked into the war, World War I. People have sleepwalked into into accepting a single version of the economic world. And thus, you as a young people interested in politics, for example, might ask a question that, let us say, that not just I ask, but Pope Francis asks, and that is, how can rating agencies that themselves participated in the defective products advise countries and condemn countries in terms of whether, in fact, that they are making progress with their people's welfare or not? It's a questionable problem. Those of us who ever stood for election, you stand before the people. You are elected, and your decisions can be reviewed in the electoral process. No one elects rating agencies, but they are part of a particular view of economics that is condemned by people like Lord Skidelsky, the great biographer John Maynard Keynes, by many, many others. But yet at the same time, they are not able to change the thinking. Because behind every economic policy is an intellectual set of ideas. And these set of ideas, we say in the universities where both of us are familiar, in North America. In North America, you may go through, get an economics degree, and not spend 1/8 of the time on the history of the subject, or encountering different models. And thus, in 2000 at the Sorbonne, again and again in Cambridge in the same year, students protested not because they were left or right. They protested and asked to be taught their subject in a pluralist way. That's why I use the word pluralist. I'm not really interested in competing ideological denunciations. But as a university teacher, if I was teaching my subject again today, I would feel a moral obligation to teach my subject in a pluralist way, to offer the assumptions that are guiding particular theories to students and to others. But to your question, I would say, if I was the worst state, I think, that would happen to young people, is that they would be invited to cynicism. To be invited to cynicism, to be invited to the idea that nothing matters but yourself, to a form of consumption, or also to accept the forms and structures of institutions, even politics, as inevitable and as being of the only kind. Raymond Williams is one of the theorists that I so regularly quoted when I was teaching. And when I had a conversation with 800 young people after I became president, I quoted him again. And he said, "Be the arrow, not the target." And he said in his last statement, then he said, "It is when you have questioned the inevitabilities that you have taken your first small steps in a journey of hope." And that is very, very important. But it's very important to be able to do so with an invitation from both your heart and your head to others to join you, understanding and listening to them as they listen to you.
Final question? Time running out?
Good morning, Mr. President. It's really a great honor to see your speech. And as a prestigious poet, how do you see the role of culture in the multilateral context, and how culture influences the mutual understandings between different countries? Thank you.
Aha.
Poetry, yes. Yeah. I think there's recently I was in Wales participating in a tribute to Dylan Thomas. And Dylan Thomas is a very interesting example of a short life with very brilliant work, such as Under Milkwood and so on. But I listened afterwards to Richard Burton's recording of Under Milkwood. And even as one listened to the R's in his description of Clara Gurp and so on, you realized that there is poetry that is performed, poetry that is delivered as a piece of communication. Now that is preceded, as was in his work, by, of course, there is a poetic instinct. Then sometimes there is the craft of poetry, which is it requires discipline and work, and the reworking of many lines. Some of our greatest Irish poets, say those who, for example, not only written in the English language, but have translated the Irish language and who've written in Irish, be it in terms of Moramach and the Nuala Ní Dhomhnaill, but very particularly Thomas Kinsella, are interested in the line, it's in the piece of work itself. But Nuala Ní Dhomhnaill performs the work. But if you look at Thomas Kinsella's work, it is very, 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 of a very, very high standard. It's of interest to know in the ones that you'll be listening at in the Irish studies. I would suggest that it isn't insignificant that Yeats didn't like reading his poems. So you have those, for example, who are interested in a composition that is informed intellectually and somewhere that takes on a shape aesthetically that meets standards for the page. And then you have those who, in fact, perform and deliver the poem and so forth. Seamus Heaney would have been who's our last Nobel laureate, whom we miss very, very much, would be an example of somebody who did both. And I think that was perhaps his strength. Michael Longley, his other poet in Northern Ireland, he's another one. Paul Dirk and Paula Meehan, who performed here in Beijing. These are all, we have some very, very good poets. I would stress it is work, but there is in fact actually something very special about taking the work out and testing it in the public. If I have one suggestion I would make, because I've done this myself, I've gone out and read poems publicly in many cases. The only thing you should never do is apologize for your work in advance. That's a deadly fault altogether. You're finished if you do that. I've been at places where people say, I don't know whether you will like this or not, and something like that. Well, you're gone from that moment on. You are better, in fact, as they would say in sport as well as in poetry. You're better for when you have it finished to the best of your ability. And it is a distillation. You have an instinct and then you have a distillation of words. And the only guide I would say is what works is when you have a correspondence and a resonance between the life, the line, and the work itself and the theme. Then something happens. And there's nothing more wonderful. Poetry is important. All forms of the arts are important. And you notice as well is that cultures know no borders. And you should use every opportunity. We must all do to take all of our opportunities to participate in all these forms, be it not just in poetry and stuff of the literature as well, but also in dance and music and so on. Isn't that the world that we want to create? And economists too. Remember John Maynard Keynes had a great interest. We married to Lydia Lopakova and loved not only the ballet itself, but the music of the ballet. I wish you well in it all. Thank you for listening to me, and thank you for the wonderful.